Lena Rivers by Mary Jane Holmes Part 2 out of 7. Praising Lena, in whom he began to feel a degree of interest for which he could not account. He did not know that way down in the depths of his heart, clouded over as it was by worldly selfishness, there was yet a tender spot, a lingering memory of his only sister whom Lena so strongly resembled. If left to himself, he would undoubtedly have taken pride in seeing his niece improve, and as it was, he determined that she should at home receive the same instruction that his daughters did. Perhaps he might not send her away to school. He didn't know how that would be. His wife held the purse, and taking refuge behind that excuse, he for the present dismissed the subject. So much for marrying a rich wife and nothing else. This we throw in gratis. Meantime, Grandma had returned to her room, at the door of which she found John Jr. and Carrie, both curious to know what was in those boxes, one of which had burst open and been tied up with a rope. "Come, children," said she, "don't stay out there, come in." "We prefer remaining here," said Carrie in a tone and manner so nearly resembling her mother that Mrs. Nichols could not refrain from saying, "Chip of the old block." "That's so, by cracky! You've hit her this time, Granny," exclaimed John Jr., snapping his fingers under Carrie's nose, which, being rather long, was frequently a subject of his ridicule. "Let me be, John Livingstone," said Carrie, while Lena resolved never again to use the word granny, which she knew her cousin had taken up on purpose to tease her. "Come, Lena, catch hold and help me untie this rope. I believe the crockery's in here," said Mrs. Nichols to Lena, who soon opened the chest, disclosing to view as motley a variety of articles as is often seen. Among the rest was the blue set, a part of her setting out, as his grandmother told John Jr., at the same time dwelling at length upon their great value. Mistaking Carrie's look of contempt for envy, Mrs. Nichols chucked her under the chin, telling her maybe there was something for her, if she was a good girl. "Now, cad, turn your nose up clear to the top of your head," said John Jr., vastly enjoying his sister's vexation. "Where does your marm keep her china? I want to put this with it," said Mrs. Nichols to Anna, who, uncertain what reply to make, looked at Carrie to answer for her. "I reckon mother don't want that old stuff stuck into her china closet," said Carrie, elevating her nose to a height wholly satisfactory to John Jr., who unbuttoned one of his waistband buttons to give himself room to laugh. "Mortal sakes alive, I wonder if she don't," returned Mrs. Nichols, beginning to get an inkling of Carrie's character, and the estimation in which her valuables were held. "Here's a nice little cupboard over the fireplace. I should put them here," said Lena. "Yes," chimed in John Jr., imitating both his grandmother and cousin. "Yes, Granny, put 'em there." The niggers are awful critters to steal, and like enough you should lose 'em if they sot in with marms." This argument prevailed. The dishes were put away in the cupboard, Lena thinking that with all his badness John Jr. was of some use after all. At last, tired of looking on, Anna suggested to Lena, who did not seem to be helping matters forward much, that they should go and be dressed up as had been first proposed. Readily divining her sister's intention, Carrie ran with it to her mother, who sent back word that Lena must mind her own affairs and let Anna's dresses alone. This undeserved thrust made Lena cry, while Anna declared her mother never said any such thing, which Carrie understood as an insinuation that she had told a falsehood. Accordingly, a quarrel of words ensued between the two sisters, which was finally quelled by John Jr., who called to Carrie to come down, as she should got a letter from Durward Belmont. Durward, how that name made Lena's heart leap! Was it her Durward, the boy in the cars? She almost hoped not, for somehow the idea of his writing to Carrie was not a pleasant one. At last, summoning courage, she asked Anna who he was, and was told that he lived in Louisville with his stepfather, Mr. Graham, and that Carrie about 2 months before had met him in Frankfort at Colonel Douglas, where she was in the habit of visiting. "Colonel Douglas," continued Anna, "has got a right nice little girl whose name is Nellie. Then there's Mabel Ross, a sort of cousin, who lives with them part of the time. She's an orphan, and a great heiress. You mustn't tell anybody for the world, but I overheard Ma say that she wanted John to marry Mabel. She's so rich, but pshaw, he want for she's awful babyish and ugly looking. Captain Atherton is related to Nellie, and during the holidays she and Mabel are coming up to spend a week. And I will bet Durward is coming too. Cad teased him, and he said maybe he would if he didn't go to college this fall. I will run down and see." Soon returning, she brought the news that it was as she had conjectured. Durward, who was now traveling, was not going to college until the next fall, and at Christmas he was coming to the country with his cousin. "Oh, I am so glad," said Anna. "We will have a time, for Ma will invite them here, of course. Cad thinks a heap of Durward, and I want so bad to see him." "Don't you?" Lena made no direct reply, for much as she would like to see her companion do voyage, she felt an unwillingness to meet him in the presence of Carrie, who she knew would spare no pains to mortify her. Soon forgetting Durward, Anna again alluded to her plan of dressing Lena, wishing Cad would mind her own business. Then, as a new idea entered her head, she brightened up, exclaiming, "I know what I can do. I will have Corinda curl your hair real pretty. You've got beautiful hair, a heap nicer than my yellow flax." Lena offered no remonstrance, and Corinda, who came at the call of her young mistress, immediately commenced brushing and curling the bright, wavy hair which Anna had rightly called beautiful. While this was going on, Grandma Nichols, who had always adhered to the good old puritanical custom of dining exactly at 12 o'clock, began to wonder why dinner was not forthcoming. She had breakfasted in Versailles, but like many travelers, could not eat much at a hotel, and now her stomach clamored loudly for food. 3 times had she walked back and forth before what she supposed was the kitchen, and from which a savory smell of something was issuing. And at last, determining to stop and reconnoiter, she started for the door. The northern reader, at all acquainted with southern life, knows well that a kitchen there and a kitchen here are 2 widely different things ours, particularly in the country, being frequently used as a dining room, while a southern lady would almost as soon think of eating in the barn as in her cook-room. Like most other planters, Mr. Livingstone's kitchen was separate, and at some little distance from the main building, causing Grandma to wonder how the poor critters managed to carry victuals back, and to when it was cold and slippery. When Aunt Milly, who was up to her elbows in dough, saw her visitor approaching, she exclaimed, "Lor a'mighty, if thar ain't ole Miss coming straight into this lookin' hole, Jeff, you quit that ar pockin' in dem ashes, and knock lyin' out that kittle, does you har, and you, Polly," speaking to a superannuated negress who was sitting near the table, "you just shove that ar piece of dough I done saved to bake for you and me under your char, whar she want see it." Polly complied, and by this time Mrs. Nichols was at the door, surveying the premises, and thinking how differently she should make things look after a little. "Does Missus want anything?" asked Aunt Milly, and Grandma replied, "Yes, I want to know if 'tain't nigh about noon." This is a term never used among the blacks, and rolling up her white eyes, Aunt Milly answered, "You done got me now. Sartin for this chilly know nothin' what you mean more'n the deadest critter livin'." As well as she could, Mrs. Nichols explained her meaning, and Aunt Milly replied, "Oh, yes, yes, I know now." "Is it most dinner time?" "Yes, dinner will be done ready in an hour." "We never has it till 2 no day, and when we has company not till 3. Confident that she should starve, Mrs. Nichols advanced a step or 2 into the kitchen, whereupon Aunt Milly commenced making excuses, saying she was going to clar up one of these days, and then if Thomas Jefferson and Marquis de Lafayette didn't quit that litterin' they should cotch it. Attracted by the clean appearance of Aunt Polly, who, not having to work, prided herself upon always being neatly dressed, Mrs. Nichols walked up to her, and, to use a vulgar expression, the 2 old ladies were soon hand in glove. Mrs. Nichols informing her of her loss, and how sorry Nancy Scavendike would feel when she heard of it, and ending by giving her the full particulars of her husband's sickness and death. In return, Aunt Polly said that she was born and bred along with old Master Richards, Miss Matilda's father, and that she, too, had buried a husband. With a deep sigh, Mrs. Nichols was about to commiserate her, when Aunt Polly cut her short by saying, "'Twa'n't of no kind o' account, as she never relished him much. Some drunken critter, I warrant," thought Mrs. Nichols, at the same time asking what his name was. "Jeems," said Aunt Polly. This was not definite enough for Mrs. Nichols, who asked for the surname. "Jeems what?" "Jeems Atherton, I reckon, bane he longed to old Marster Atherton," said Polly. For a time Mrs. Nichols had forgotten her hunger, But the habit of 60 years was not so easily broken, and she now hinted so strongly of the emptiness of her stomach that Aunt Polly, emboldened by her familiarity, said, "I never wait for the rest, but have my cup of tea or coffee just when I feel like it. And if Missus wouldn't mind tacking a bite with a nigger, she's welcome. Say nothing about it. We shall all be white in heaven." "Dat am de truth," muttered Milly, mentally assigning Mrs. Nichols a more exalted occupation than that of turning hoe cakes. 2 cups and saucers were forthwith produced, Milly acting as a waiter for fear Aunt Polly would leave her seat and so disclose to view the loaf of bread which had been hidden under the chair. Some coffee was poured from the pot, which still stood on the stove, and then the little negroes, amused with the novelty of the thing, ran shouting and yelling that Ole Miss was eaten in the kitchen long with Lion and Polly and the other dogs. The coffee being drank, Mrs. Nichols returned to the house, thinking what sights of comfort she should take with Mrs. Atherton, whom she pronounced to be a likely, clever woman as ever was. Scarcely had she reached her room when the dinner bell rang, every note falling like an ice bolt on the heart of Lena, who, though hungry like her grandmother, still greatly dreaded the dinner, fearing her inability to acquit herself creditably. Corinda had finished her hair, and Anna, looking over her wardrobe and coming upon the black dress which her father had purchased for her, had insisted upon Lena's wearing it. It was of rather more modern make than any of her other dresses, and when her toilet was completed, she looked uncommonly well. Still she trembled violently as Anna led her to the dining-room. Neither Mrs. Nichols nor Mrs. Livingstone had yet made their appearance, but the latter soon came languidly in, wrapped in a rose-colored shawl, which John Jr. said she wore to give a delicate tint to her yellow complexion. She was in the worst of humors, having just been opening her husband's trunk, where she found the numerous articles which had been stowed away by Nancy Scavendike. Very angrily she had ordered them removed from her sight, and at this very moment the little negroes in the yard were playing with the cracked bellows, calling them a blubber, and filling them with water to see it run out. Except through the window, Mrs. Livingstone had not yet seen Lena, and now dropping into her chair, she never raised her eyes until Anna said, "Mother, mother, this is Lena. Look at her." Thus importuned, Mrs. Livingstone looked up, and the frown with which she was prepared to greet her niece softened somewhat. For Lena was not a child to be looked upon and despised. Plain and humble as was her dress, there was something in her fine, open face which at once interested and commanded respect. John Jr. had felt it, his father had felt it, and his mother felt it too, but it awoke in her a feeling of bitterness as she thought how the fair young girl before her might in time rival her daughters. At a glance, she saw that Lena was beautiful, and that it was quite as much a beauty of intellect as of feature and form. Yes, thought she, husband was right when he said that, with the same advantages, she should soon outstrip her cousins, but it shall never be never. And the white teeth shut firmly together, as the cold, proud woman bowed a welcome. At this moment Mrs. Nichols appeared. Stimulated by the example of Lena, She, too, had changed her dress, and now in black bombazine, white muslin cap, and shining silk apron, she presented so respectable an appearance that her son's face instantly brightened. "Come, mother, we are waiting for you," said he as she stopped on her way to ask Vine, the fly girl, how she did, and if it wasn't hard work to swing them feathers. Not being very bright, Vine replied with a grim, "Dun no, miss." Taking her seat next to her son, Mrs. Nichols said when offered a plate of soup, "I don't often eat broth. Besides that, I ain't much hungry, as I've just been tackin' a bite with Miss Atherton." "With whom?" asked Mr. Livingstone. "John Jr., Carrie, and Anna," in the same breath. "With Miss Polly Atherton, that nice old colored lady in the kitchen," said Mrs. Nichols. The scowl on Mrs. Livingstone's face darkened visibly, while her husband, thinking it time to speak, said, "It is my wish, mother, that you keep away from the kitchen. It does the negroes no good to be meddled with, and besides that, when you are hungry the servants will take you something." "Accustomed to eat in the kitchen, probably," muttered Carrie, with all the air of a young lady of 20. "Hold on to your nose, cad," whispered John Jr., thereby attracting his sister's attention to himself. By this time the soup was removed, and a fine large turkey appeared. "What a noble great feller, Gobbler, ain't it?" asked Mrs. Nichols, touching the turkey with the knife. John Jr. roared, and was ordered from the table by his father, while Lena, who stepped on her grandmother's toes to keep her from talking, was told by that lady to keep her feet still. Along with the dessert came ice cream, which Mrs. Nichols had never before tasted. And now, fancying that she was dreadfully burned, she quickly deposited her first mouthful upon her plate. "What's the matter, Grandma? Can't you eat it?" asked Anna. "Yes, I can eat it, but I don't hanker arter it," answered her grandmother, pushing the plate aside. Dinner being over, Mrs. Nichols returned to her room, but soon growing weary, she started out to view the premises. Coming suddenly upon a group of young negroes, she discovered her bellows, the water dripping from the nose, while a little farther on she espied Lena's bonnet, which the negroes had at last succeeded in catching, and which, wet as it was, now adorned the head of Thomas Jefferson. In a trice the old lady's principles were forgotten, and she cuffed the negroes with a right good will, hitting Jeff the hardest, and, as a matter of course, making him yell the loudest. Out came Aunt Milly, scolding and muttering about white folks tendin' to thar own business, and reversing her decision with regard to Mrs. Nichols' position in the next world. Cuff, the watchdog, whose kennel was close by, set up a tremendous howling, while John Jr., always on hand, danced a jig to the sound of the direful music. "For heaven's sake, husband, go out and see what's the matter," said Mrs. Livingstone, slightly alarmed at the unusual noise. John complied, and reached the spot just in time to catch a glimpse of John Jr.'s heels as he gave the finishing touch to his exploit, while Mrs. Nichols, highly incensed, marched from the field of battle with the bonnet and bellows, thinking if them niggers was only hern they should catch it. Chapter Romans 7, Malcolm Everett. It would be tiresome both to ourselves and our readers were we to enumerate the many mortifications which both Mr. and Mrs. Livingstone were compelled to endure from their mother, who gradually came to understand her true position in the family. One by one her ideas of teaching them economy were given up, as was also all hopes of ever being at all familiar with her daughter, whom, at her son's request, she had ceased to call Tilda. "Maybe you want me to say Miss Livingstone," said she, "but I shan't. I will call her Miss Nichols or Matilda, just which she chooses." Of course Mrs. Livingstone chose the latter, wincing, though, every time she heard it, dreading a scene which he knew was sure to follow a disclosure of his engagement with Miss Nancy. Mr. Livingstone had requested his mother to keep it from his wife, and she, appreciating his motive, promised secrecy, lamenting the while the ill fortune which had prevented Nancy from being her daughter-in-law, and dwelling frequently upon the comfort she should take were Nancy there in Matilda's place. On the whole, however, she was tolerably contented. The novelty of Kentucky life pleased her, and at last, like most northern people, she fell in with the habits of those around her. Still her Massachusetts friends were not forgotten, and many a letter, wonderful for its composition and orthography, found its way to Nancy Scavendike, who wrote in return that some time or other she should surely visit Kentucky, asking further if the big bugs didn't prefer Eastern teachers for their children, and hinting at her desire to engage in that capacity when she came south. "Now, that's the very thing," exclaimed Mrs. Nichols, folding the letter directed wrong side up, and resuming her knitting. "Nancy's larnin' is plenty good enough to teach Caroline and Annie, and I mean to speak to John about it right away." "I wouldn't do any such thing," said Lena, seeing at a glance how such a proposal would be received. "Why not?" asked Mrs. Nichols, and Lena replied, "I don't think Nancy would suit Aunt Livingstone at all, and besides that, they've engaged a teacher, a Mr. Everett, and expect him next week." "You don't say so," returned Mrs. Nichols. "I never heard a word on't. Whereabouts is he from, and how much do they give him a week?" The latter Lena knew nothing about, but she replied that she believed he was from Rockford, a village near Rochester, New York. "Why, Nancy Scavendike's sister lives there." "I wouldn't wonder if he knew her, very likely," returned Lena, catching her bonnet and hurrying off to ride with Captain Atherton and Anna. As we have once before observed, Anna was a great favorite with the captain, who had petted her until John Jr. teased her unmercifully, calling him her gray-haired lover, and the like. This made Anna exceedingly sensitive, and now when the captain called for her to ride, as he frequently did, she refused to go unless the invitation was also extended to Lena, who in this way got many a pleasant ride around the country. She was fast learning to like Kentucky, and would have been very happy had her aunt and Carrie been a little more gracious. But the former seldom spoke to her, and the latter only to ridicule something which she said or did. Many and amusing were the disputes between the two girls concerning their peculiarities of speech, Carrie bidding Lena quit her Yankee habit of eternally guessing, and Lena retorting that she would when Carrie stopped her everlasting reckoning. To avoid the remarks of the neighbors, who she knew were watching her narrowly, Mrs. Livingstone had purchased Lena 2 or 3 dresses, which, though greatly inferior to those worn by Carrie and Anna, were still fashionably made, and so much improved Lena's looks that her manners improved also, for what child does not appear to better advantage when conscious of looking well? More than once had her uncle's hand rested for a moment on her brown curls, while his thoughts were traversing the past, and in fancy his fingers were again straying among the silken locks now resting in the grave. It would seem as if the mother from her coffin was pleading for her child, for all the better nature of Mr. Livingstone was aroused. And when he secured the services of Mr. Everett, who was highly recommended both as a scholar and gentleman, he determined that Lena should share the same advantages with his daughters. To this Mrs. Livingstone made no serious objection, for as Mr. Everett would teach in the house, it would not do to debar Lena from the privilege of attending his school, and as the highest position to which she could aspire was to be governess in some private family, she felt willing, she said, that she should have a chance of acquiring the common branches. And now Mr. Everett was daily expected. Anna, who had no fondness for books, greatly dreaded his arrival, thinking within herself how many pranks she should play off upon him, provided Lena would lend a helping hand, which she much doubted. John Jr., too, who for a time, at least, was to be placed under Mr. Everett's instruction, felt in no wise eager for his arrival, fearing, as he told Lena, that between the old man and the tutor he would be kept a little too straight for a gentleman of his habits, and it was with no particular emotions of pleasure that he and Anna saw the stage stop before the gate one pleasant morning toward the middle of November. Running to one of the front windows, Carrie, Lena, and Anna watched their new teacher, each after her own fashion commenting upon his appearance. "Ugh!" exclaimed Anna, "what a green, boyish-looking thing! I reckon nobody's going to be afraid of him." "I say he's real handsome," said Carrie, who, being 13 years of age, had already, in her own mind, practiced many a little coquetry upon the stranger. "I like him," was Lena's brief remark. Mr. Everett was a pale, intellectual-looking man, scarcely 20 years of age, and appearing still younger, so that Anna was not wholly wrong when she called him boyish. Still there was in his large black eye a firmness and decision which bespoke the man strong within him, and which put to flight all of Anna's preconceived notions of rebellion. With the utmost composure he returned Mrs. Livingstone's greeting, and the proud lady half bit her lip with vexation as she saw how little he seemed awed by her presence. Malcolm Everett was not one to acknowledge superiority where there was none, and though ever polite toward Mrs. Livingstone, there was something in his manner which forbade her treating him as aught save an equal. He was not to be trampled down, and for once in her life Mrs. Livingstone had found a person who would neither cringe to her nor flatter. The children were not presented to him until dinner time, when, with the air of a young desperado, John Jr. marched into the dining room, eyeing his teacher askance, calculating his strength, and returning his greeting with a simple nod. Mr. Everett scanned him from head to foot, and then turned to Carrie, half smiling at the great dignity which she assumed. With Lena and Anna he seemed better pleased, holding their hands and smiling down upon them through rows of teeth, which Anna pronounced the whitest she had ever seen. Mr. Livingstone was not at home, and when his mother appeared, Mrs. Livingstone did not think proper to introduce her. But if by this omission she thought to keep the old lady silent, she was mistaken, for the moment Mrs. Nichols was seated, she commenced with, "Your name is Everett, I believe." "Yes, Mom," said he, bowing very gracefully toward her. "Any kin to the governor that was?" "No, Mom, none whatever," and the white teeth became slightly visible for a moment, but soon disappeared. "You are from Rockford, Lena tells me." "Yes, Mom. Have you friends there?" "Yes, or that is, Nancy Scavendike's sister, Betsy Scavendike that used to be, lives there. Maybe you know her. Her name is Bacon, Betsy Bacon. She's a widder and keeps boarders." "Ah," said he, the teeth this time becoming wholly visible, "I've heard of Mrs. Bacon, but have not the honor of her acquaintance. You are from the East, I perceive." "Law, now, how did you know that?" asked Mrs. Nichols, while Mr. Everett answered, "I guessed at it," with a peculiar emphasis on the word guessed, which led Lena to think he had used it purposely and not from habit. Mr. Everett possessed in a remarkable degree the faculty of making those around him both respect and like him, and ere 6 weeks had passed, he had won the love of all his pupils. Even John Jr. was greatly improved, and Carrie seemed suddenly reawakened into a thirst for knowledge. Deeming no task too long, and no amount of study too hard, if it won the commendation of her teacher, Lena, who committed to memory with great ease, and who consequently did not deserve so much credit for her always perfect lessons, seldom received a word of praise, while poor Anna, notoriously lazy when books were concerned, cried almost every day, because, as she said, Mr. Everett didn't like her as he did the rest, else why did he look at her so much, watching her all the while, and keeping her after school to get her lessons over, when he knew how she hated them. Once Mrs. Livingstone ventured to remonstrate, telling him that Anna was very sensitive, and required altogether different treatment from Carrie. "She thinks you dislike her," said she, "and while she retains this impression, she will do nothing as far as learning is concerned. So if you do not like her, try and make her think you do." There was a peculiar look in Mr. Everett's dark eyes as he answered, "You may think it strange, Mrs. Livingstone, but of all my pupils I love Anna the best. I know I find more fault with her, and am perhaps more severe with her than with the rest. But it's because I would make her what I wish her to be. Pardon me, madam, but Anna does not possess the same amount of intellect with her cousin or sister, but by proper culture she will make a fine intelligent woman. Mrs. Livingstone hardly relished being told that one child was inferior to the other. But she could not well help herself. Mr. Everett would say what he pleased, and thus the conference ended. From that time Mr. Everett was exceedingly kind to Anna, wiping away the tears which invariably came when told that she must stay with him in the schoolroom after the rest were gone. Then, instead of seating himself in rigid silence at a distance until her task was learned, he would sit by her side, occasionally smoothing her long curls and speaking encouragingly to her as she pored over some hard rule of grammar, or puzzled her brains with some difficult problem in Colburn. Ere long the result of all this became manifest. Anna grew fonder of her books, more ready to learn, and more willing to be kept after school. Ah, little did Mrs. Livingstone think what she was doing when she bade young Malcolm Everett make her warm-hearted, impulsive daughter think he liked her. Chapter Roman 8. Scheming. Mother, where's Lena's dress? Hasn't she got any? Asked Anna one morning, about 2 weeks before Christmas, as she bent over a promiscuous pile of merinos, delaines, and plaid silks, her own and Carrie's dresses for the coming holidays. Say, Mother, didn't you buy Lena any? Thus interrogated, Mrs. Livingstone replied, I wonder if you think I am made of money. Lena is indebted to me now for more than she can ever pay. As long as I give her a home and am at so much expense in educating her, she of course can't expect me to dress her as I do you. There's Carrie's brown delaine and your blue one, which I intend to have made over for her, and she ought to be satisfied with that, for they are much better than anything she had when she came here. And the lady glanced toward the spot where Lena sat, admiring the new things, in which she had no share, and longing to ask the question which Anna had asked for her, and which had now been answered. John Jr., who was present, and who knew that Mr. Everett had been engaged to teach in the family long before it was known that Lena was coming, now said to his cousin, who arose to leave, Yes, Lena, Mother's a model of generosity, and you will never be able to repay her for her kindness in allowing you to wear the girl's old duds, which would otherwise be given to the blacks, and in permitting you to recite to Mr. Everett, who, of course, was hired on your account. The slamming together of the door as Lena left the room brought the young gentleman's remarks to a close, and wishing to escape the lecture which he saw was preparing for him, he too made his exit. Christmas was coming, and with it Durward Belmont, and about his coming Mrs. Livingstone felt some little anxiety. Always scheming, and always looking ahead, she was expecting great results from this visit. Durward was not only immensely wealthy, but was also descended on his father's side from one of England's noblemen. Altogether he was, she thought, a decided catch, and though he was now only 16, while Carrie was but 13, lifelong impressions had been made at even an earlier period, and Mrs. Livingstone resolved that her pretty daughter should at least have all the advantages of dress with which to set off her charms. Concerning Anna's appearance she cared less, for she had but little hope of her, unless, indeed, but 'twas too soon to think of that she would wait, and perhaps in good time tea would all come round naturally, and as a matter of course. So she encouraged her daughter's intimacy with Captain Atherton, who, until Malcolm Everett appeared, was in Anna's estimation the best man living. Now, however, she made an exception in favor of her teacher, who, as she told the captain, neither wore false teeth nor kept in his pocket a pair of specs, to be slyly used when he fancied no one saw him. Captain Atherton coughed, colored, laughed, and saying that Mr. Everett was a mash kind of a boy, swore eternal enmity toward him, and under the mask of friendship watched. 11 years before, when Anna was a baby, Mrs. Livingstone had playfully told the captain, who was one day deploring his want of a wife, that if he would wait he should have her daughter. To this he agreed, and the circumstance, trivial as it was, made a more than ordinary impression upon his mind. And though he as yet had no definite idea that the promise would ever be fulfilled, the little girl was to him an object of uncommon interest. Mrs. Livingstone knew this, and whenever Anna's future prospects were the subject of her meditations, she generally fell back upon that fact as an item not to be despised. Now, however, her thoughts were turned into another and widely different channel. Christmas week was to be spent by Durward Belmont partly at Captain Atherton's and partly at her own house. And as Mrs. Livingstone was not ignorant of the effect a becoming dress has upon a pretty face, she determined that Carrie should, at least, have that advantage. Anna, too, was to fare like her sister, while no thought was bestowed upon poor Lena's wardrobe, until her husband, who accompanied her to Frankfort, suggested that a certain pattern, which he fancied would be becoming to Lena, should be purchased. With an angry scowl, Mrs. Livingstone muttered something about spending so much money for other folks' young ones. Then, remembering the old Delanes, and knowing by the tone of her husband's voice that he was in earnest, she quickly rejoined, "Why, Lena's got 2 new dresses at home." Never doubting his wife's word, Mr. Livingstone was satisfied, and nothing more was said upon the subject. Business of importance made it necessary for him to go for a few weeks to New Orleans, and he was now on his way thither, his wife having accompanied him as far as Frankfort, where he took the boat, while she returned home. When Lena left the room after learning that she had no part in the mass of Christmas finery, she repaired to the Arbor Bridge, where she had wept so bitterly on the first day of her arrival, and which was now her favorite resort. For a time she sat watching the leaping waters, swollen by the winter rains, and wondering if it were not possible that they started at first from the pebbly spring which gushed so cool and clear from the mountain side near her old New England home. This reminded her of where and what she was now, a dependent on the bounty of those who wished her away, and who almost every day of her life made her feel it so keenly, too. Not one among them loved her except Anna, and would not her affection change as they grew older? Then her thoughts took another direction. Durward Belmont was coming, but did she wish to see him? Could she bear the sneering remarks which she knew Carrie would make concerning herself? And how would he be affected by them? Would he ask her of her father? And if so, what had she to say? Many a time had she tried to penetrate the dark mystery of her birth, but her grandmother was wholly non-committal. Once, 2. When her uncle seemed kinder than usual, she had ventured to ask him of her father, and with a frown he had replied that the least she knew of him the better. Still Lena felt sure that he was a good man, and that some time or other she would find him. All day long the clouds had been threatening rain, which began to fall soon after Lena entered the arbor. But so absorbed was she in her own thoughts that she did not observe it until her clothes were perfectly dampened. Then, starting up, she repaired to the house. For several days she had not been well, and this exposure brought on a severe cold, which confined her to her room for nearly 2 weeks. Meantime, the dressmaking process went on, Anna keeping Lena constantly apprised of its progress, and occasionally wearing in some article for her inspection. This reminded Lena of her own wardrobe, and knowing that it would not be attended to while she was sick, she made such haste to be well, that on Thursday at tea-time she took her accustomed seat at the table. After supper she lingered a while in the parlor, hoping something would be said, but she waited in vain, and was about leaving, when a few words spoken by Carrie in an adjoining room caught her ear and arrested her attention. They were, "And so Lena came down tonight. I dare say she thinks you will set Miss Simpson at work upon my old Delane." "Perhaps so," returned Mrs. Livingstone, "but I don't see how Miss Simpson can do it, unless you put off having that silk apron embroidered." "I shan't do any such thing," said Carrie, glad of an excuse to keep Lena out of the way. "What matter is it if she don't come down when the company are here? I should rather she wouldn't, for she's so green and awkward. And Delward is so fastidious in such matters, that I should rather he wouldn't know she's a relative of ours. I know he should tell his mother. And they say she is very particular about his associates." Lena's first impulse was to defy her cousin to her face, to tell her she had seen Delward Belmont, and that he didn't laugh at her either. But her next thought was calmer and more rational. Possibly under Carrie's influence he might make fun of her, and resolving on no condition whatever to make herself visible while he was in the house, she returned to her room, and throwing herself upon the bed, wept until she fell asleep. "When is Miss Simpson going to fix Lena's dress?" asked Anna as day after day passed, and nothing was said of the brown Delane. For an instant Miss Simpson's nimble fingers were still, as she awaited the answer to a question which had occurred to her several times. She was a kind-hearted, intelligent girl, and at a glance had seen how matters stood. She, too, was an orphan, and her sympathies were all enlisted in behalf of the neglected Lena. She had heard from Anna of the brown Delane, and in her own mind she had determined that it should be fitted with the utmost taste of which she was capable. Her speculations, however, were brought to a close by Mrs. Livingstone's saying in reply to Anna that Lena seemed so wholly uninterested, and cared so little about seeing the company, she had decided not to have the dress fixed until after Christmas week. The fiery expression of 2 large, glittering eyes, which at that moment peered in at the door, convinced Miss Simpson that her employer had hardly told the truth, and she secretly determined that Lena should have the dress whether she would or not. Accordingly, the next time she and Anna were alone, she asked for the Delane, entrusting her secret to Anna, who, thinking no harm, promised to keep it from her mother. But to get Lena fitted was a more difficult matter. Her spirit was roused, and for a time she resisted their combined efforts. At last, however, she yielded, and by working late at night in her own room, Miss Simpson managed to finish the dress, in which Lena really looked better than did either of her cousins in their garments of far richer materials. Still, she was resolved not to go down, and Anna, fearing what her mother might say, dared not urge her very strongly, hoping, though, that something would turn up. Doward Belmont, Nellie Douglas, and Mabel Ross had arrived at Captain Atherton's. Mrs. Livingstone and her daughters had called upon them, inviting them to spend a few days at Maple Grove, where they were to meet some other young people selected from the wealthiest families in the neighborhood. Mrs. Livingstone said, at the same time patting the sallow cheek of Mabel, whose reputed 100,000 she intended should one day increase the importance of her own family. The invitation was accepted. The day had arrived, the guests were momentarily expected, and Carrie, before the long mirror, was admiring herself, alternately frowning upon John Jr., who was mimicking her airs, and scolding Anna for fretting because Lena could not be induced to join them. Finding that her niece was resolved not to appear, Mrs. Livingstone, for looks' sake, had changed her tactics, saying Lena could come down if she chose. She was sure there was nothing to prevent. Knowing this, Anna had exhausted all her powers of eloquence upon her cousin. But she still remained inexorable, greatly to the astonishment of her grandmother, who for several days had been suffering from a rheumatic affection. Notwithstanding which she meant to hobble down if possible, for, said she, I want to see this Doward Belmont. Matilda says he's got noble blood in him. I used to know a family of nobles in Massachusetts, and I think like as not he's some kin. Carrie, to whom this remark was made, communicated it to her mother, who forthwith repaired to Mrs. Nichols's room, telling her that 'twas a child's party, and hinting pretty strongly that she was neither wanted nor expected in the parlor, and would confer a great favor by keeping aloof. Wall, said Mrs. Nichols, who had learned to dread her daughter's displeasure. I should as lief stay up here as not, but I do want Lena to join 'em. She's young and would enjoy it. Without a word of answer, Mrs. Livingstone walked away, leaving Lena more determined than ever not to go down. When the evening at last arrived, Anna insisted so strongly upon her wearing the Delane, for fear of what might happen, that Lena consented, curling her hair with great care, and feeling a momentary thrill of pride as she saw how well she looked. When we get nicely to enjoying ourselves, said Anna, you come down and look through the glass door, for I do want you to see Doward. He's so handsome, but there's the carriage, I must go, and away ran Anna down the stairs, while Lena flew to one of the front windows to see the company as they rode up. First came Captain Atherton's carriage, and in it the captain and his maiden sister, together with a pale, sickly-looking girl whom Lena knew to be Mabel Ross. Behind them rode Durward Belmont, and at his side, on a spirited little pony, was another girl, 13 or 14 years of age, but in her long riding dress looking older, because taller. Lena readily guessed that this was Nellie Douglas, and at a glance she recognized the Durward of the cars, grown handsomer and taller since then. She thought. With a nimble bound he leaped from his saddle, kissing his hand to Carrie, who with her sunniest smile ran past him to welcome Nellie. A pang, not of jealousy, but of an undefined something, shot through Lena's heart, and dropping the heavy curtain, she turned away, while the tears gathered thickly in her large brown eyes. "Where's Lena?" asked Captain Atherton of Anna, warming his red fingers before the blazing grate, and looking round upon the group of girls gathered near. Glancing at her mother, Anna replied, "She says she don't want to come down." "Bashful," returned the captain, while Nellie Douglas asked who Lena was, at the same time returning the pinch which John Jr. had slyly given her as a mode of showing his preference, for Nellie was his favorite. Fearful of Anna's reply, Mrs. Livingstone answered carelessly, "She's the child of one of Mr. Livingstone's poor relations, and we've taken her a while out of charity. At any other time John Jr. would doubtless have questioned his mother's word, but now so engrossed was he with the merry, hoydenish Nellie, that he scarcely heard her remark, or noticed the absence of Lena. With the exception of his cousin, Nellie was the only girl whom John Jr. could endure. The rest, he said, were so stuck up and affected. For Mabel Ross, he seemed to have a particular aversion, not because she was so very disagreeable, but because his mother continually reminded him of what she hoped would one day be. And this, he said, was enough to make a feller hate a girl. So, without considering that Mabel was not to blame, he ridiculed her unmercifully, calling her a bundle of medicine, and making fun of her thin, sallow face, which really appeared to great disadvantage when contrasted with Nellie's bright eyes and round, rosy cheeks. When the guests were all assembled, Carrie, not knowing whether Durward Belmont would relish plays, seated herself demurely upon the sofa, prepared to act the dignified young lady or any other character she might think necessary. "Get up, cad," said John Jr. "Nobody's going to act like they were at a funeral. Get up, and let's play something." As the rest seemed to be similarly inclined, Carrie arose, and ere long the joyous shouts reached Lena, making her half wish that she, too, was there. Remembering Anna's suggestion of looking through the glass door, she stole softly down the stairs, and stationing herself behind the door, looked in on the scene. Mr. Everett, usually so dignified, had joined in the game, claiming forfeits from Anna more frequently than was considered at all necessary by the captain, who for a time looked jealously on, and then, declaring himself as young as any of them, joined them with a right good will. Blind man's buff was next proposed, and Lena's heart leaped up, for that was her favorite game. John Jr. was first blinded, but he caught them so easily that all declared he could see, and loud were the calls for Durward to take his place. This he willingly did, and whether he could see or not, he suffered them to pass directly under his hands, thus giving entire satisfaction. On account of the heat of the rooms, Anna, on passing the glass door, threw it open, and the next time Doward came round he marched directly into the hall, seizing Lena, who was trying to hide. Feeling her long curls, he exclaimed, "Anna, you are caught." "No, I ain't Anna. Let me go," said Lena, struggling to escape. This brought all the girls to the spot, while Doward, snatching the muffler from his eyes, looked down with astonishment upon the trembling Lena, who would have escaped had she not been so securely hemmed in. "Ain't you ashamed, Lena, to be peeking?" asked Carrie, while Doward repeated, "Lena, Lena, I've seen her before in the cars between Springfield and Albany." "But how came she here?" "She lives here, she's our cousin," said Anna, notwithstanding the twitch given to her sleeve by Carrie, who did not care to have the relationship exposed. "Your cousin," said Doward, "and where's the old lady who was with her?" "The one she called Granny?" asked John Jr., on purpose to rouse up his fiery little cousin. "No, I don't call her Granny, neither I've quit it," said Lena angrily, adding, as a sly hit at Kentucky talk, "She's upstairs, sick with the rheumatism." "Good," said Doward, "but why are you not down here with us?" "I didn't want to come," was her reply, and Doward, leading her into the parlor, continued, "But now that you are here, you must stay. Pretty, isn't she?" said Nellie, as the full blaze of the chandelier fell upon Lena. "Rather," was Carrie's hesitating reply. She felt annoyed that Lena should be in the parlor, and provoked that Doward should notice her in any way, and at the first opportunity told him how much she both troubled and mortified them by her vulgarity and obstinacy, adding that she had a most violent temper. From Nellie she had learned that Doward particularly disliked passionate girls, and for this reason she strove to give him the impression that Lena was such an one. Once or twice she fancied him half inclined to disbelieve her, as he saw how readily Lena joined in their amusements, and how good-humoredly she bore John Jr.'s teasing, and then she hoped something would occur to prove her words true. Her wish was gratified. The next day was dark and stormy, confining the young people to the house. About 10 o'clock the Negro who had been to the post office returned, bringing letters for the family, among which was one for Lena, so curious in its shape and superscription that even the Negro grinned as he handed it out. Lena was not then present, and Carrie, taking the letter, exclaimed, "Now if this isn't the last specimen from Yankeedom! Just listen," and she spelled out the direction to Miss Lena Rivers, State of Kentucky, County of Woodford, Dorsey Post Office, care of Miss Nichols. Unobserved by any one, Lena had entered the parlor in time to hear every word, and when Carrie, chancing to espy her, held out the letter, saying, "Here, Helene, I guess this came from down east," she darted forward, and striking the letter from Carrie's hands, stamped upon it with her foot, declaring she should never open it in the world, and saying they might do what they pleased with it for all of her. "Read it, may we read it?" eagerly asked Carrie, delighted to see Lena doing such justice to her reputation. "Yes, read it," almost screamed Lena, and before anyone could interpose a word, Carrie had broken the seal and commenced reading, announcing, first, that it came from Joel Slocum. It was as follows. "Dear Helene, maybe you will wonder when you see a letter from me, but I will be hanged if I can help written. I am so confounded lonesome now you are gone, that I done know nothing what to do with myself. So I set on the great rock where the saxifrax grows and think till it seems as if my head would bust open. Wall, how do you get along down amongst them heathenish Kentucks and niggers? I suppose there ain't no great difference between 'em, is there, when I get a little more larnin'? I believe I will come down there to keep school. Oh, I forgot to tell you that our old line-back cow has got a calf, the prettiest little critter Dad has gin her to me, and I call her Heleny, I do, I swow, and when she capers round she makes me think of the way you danced high putty Martin the time you stuck a sliver in your heel." Up to this point Lena had stood immovable, amid the loud shouts of her companions, but the fire of 100 volcanoes burned within and flashed from her eyes. And now, springing forward, she caught the letter from Carrie's hand, and inflicting a long scratch upon her forehead, fled from the room. Had not Durward Belmont been present, Carrie would have flown after her cousin to avenge the insult, and even now she was for a moment thrown off her guard, and starting forward exclaimed, "The tigress!" Drawing his fine cambric handkerchief from his pocket, Durward gently wiped the blood from her white brow, saying, "Never mind, it is not a deep scratch. I wish 'twas deeper," muttered John Jr. "You should know business to serve her so mean." An angry retort rose to Carrie's lips, but, just in time to prevent its utterance, Durward also spoke, saying it was too bad to tease her so, but we were all more or less to blame, and I am not sure but we ought to apologize. Carrie felt that she would die, almost, before she should apologize to such as Lena, and still she thought it might be well enough to give Durward the impression that she was doing her best to make amends for her fault. Accordingly, the next time her cousin appeared in the parlor she was all smiles and affability, talking a great deal to Lena, who returned very short but civil answers, while her face wore a look which Durward construed into defiance and hatred of everybody and everything. "Too passionate," thought he, turning from her to Carrie, whose voice, modulated to its softest tones, rang out clear and musical, as she sported and laughed with her moody cousin, appearing the very essence of sweetness and amiability. Pity he could not have known how bitterly Lena had wept over her hasty action, not because he witnessed it, but because she knew it was wrong. Pity he could not have read the tear-blotted note which she laid on Carrie's work-box, and in which was written, "I am sorry, Carrie, that I hurt you so. I didn't know what I was about, but I will try and not get so angry again." Pity, too, that he did not see the look of contempt with which Carrie perused this note. And when the two girls accidentally met in the upper hall, and Lena laid her hand gently on Carrie's arm, it is a thousand pities he was not present to see how fiercely she was repulsed, Carrie exclaiming, "Get out of my sight, I hate you." And so do all of them downstairs, Durward in particular. Had he known all this, he would have thought differently of Lena, who, feeling that she was not wanted in the parlor, kept herself entirely aloof, never again appearing during the remainder of his stay. Once Durward asked for her, and half-laughingly Carrie replied that she had not yet recovered from her pouting fit. Could he have known her real occupation, he might have changed his mind again. The stormy weather had so increased Mrs. Nichols's rheumatic complaint that now, perfectly crippled, she lay as helpless as a child, carefully nursed by Lena and old Aunt Polly, who, spite of her own infirmities, had hobbled in to wait upon her friend. Never but once did Mrs. Livingstone go near her mother's sick room. The smell of herbs made her faint, she said, but to do her justice, we must say that she gave Polly unqualified permission to order anything she pleased for the invalid. Toward the close of the third day, the company left. Nellie Douglas, who really liked Lena and wished to bid her good-bye, whispered to John Jr., asking him to show her the way to his cousin's room. No one except members of the family had ever been in Mrs. Nichols's apartment, and for a moment John Jr. hesitated, knowing well that Nellie could not fail to observe the contrast it presented to the other richly furnished chambers. They ought to be mortified, it will serve 'em right, he thought at last, and motioning Nellie to follow him, he silently led the way to his grandmother's room, where their knock was answered by Aunt Polly's gruff voice, which bade them come in. They obeyed, but Nellie started back when she saw how greatly inferior was this room to the others around it. In an instant her eye took in everything, and she readily comprehended the whole. "It isn't my doings by a jugful," whispered John Jr., himself reddening as he noted the different articles of furniture which had never before seemed so meagre and poor. On the humble bed, in a half-upright position, lay Mrs. Nichols, white as the snowy cap border which shaded her face. Behind her sat Lena, supporting her head, and when Nellie entered, she was carefully pushing back the few gray locks which had fallen over the invalid's forehead, her own bright curls mingling with them, and resting, some on her neck and some on her grandmother's shoulder. A deep flush dyed her cheeks when she saw Nellie, who thought she had never looked upon a sight more beautiful. "I did not know your grandmother was ill," said she, coming forward and gently touching the swollen hand which lay outside the counterpane. Mrs. Nichols was not too ill to talk, and forthwith she commenced a history of her malady, beginning at the time she first had it when Lena's mother was a year and a day old, frequently quoting Nancy Scavendike, and highly entertaining Nellie, who listened until warned by the sound of the carriage. As it came round to the door, that she must go. "We are going back to Uncle Atherton's," said she, "but I wanted to bid you good-bye, and ask you to visit me in Frankfort with your cousins. Will you do so?" This was wholly unexpected to Lena, who, without replying, burst in faux tears. Nellie hardly knew what to do. She seldom cried herself. She did not like to see others cry, and still she did not blame Lena, for she felt that she could not help it. At last, taking her hand, she bade her farewell, asking if she should not carry a good-bye to the others. "Yes, to Mabel," said Lena. "And not Doward?" asked Nellie. Something of her old spirit, Lena answered. "No, he hates me, Carrie says so." "Cad's a fool," muttered John Jr., while Nellie rejoined, "Doward never hated anybody, and even if he did, he would not say so. I mean to tell him." And with another good-bye she was gone. On the stairs she met Doward, who was looking for her, and asked where she had been. "To bid Lena good-bye. Don't you want to go too?" said Nellie. "Why, yes, if you are sure she won't scratch my eyes out," he returned gaily, following his cousin. "I reckon I should better tell Lena to come out into the hall. She may not want you in there," said John Jr. And hastening forward he told his cousin what was wanted. Oh, how Lena longed to go, but pride, and the remembrance of Carrie's words, prevented her, and coldly answering, "No, I don't wish to see him," she turned away to hide the tears and pain which those words had cost her. This visit to Grandma Nichol's room was productive of some good, for John Jr. did not fail of repeating to his mother the impression which he saw was made on Nellie's mind, adding that though Doward did not venture in, Nellie would of course tell him all about it. "And then," said he, "I wouldn't give much for his opinion of your treatment of your mother." Angry, because she felt the truth of what her son said, Mrs. Livingstone demanded what he should have her do. "Do," he repeated, "give grandmother a decent room, or else fix that one up, so it won't look like the old scratch had been having a cotilin there. Paper and paint it, and make it look decent." Upon this last piece of advice Mrs. Livingstone resolved to act, for recently several vague rumors had reached her ear, touching her neglect of her mother-in-law, and she began herself to think it just possible that a little of her money would be well expended in adding to the comfort of her husband's mother. Accordingly, as soon as Mrs. Nichols was able to sit up, her room underwent a thorough renovation, and though no great amount of money was expended upon it, it was fitted up with so much taste that the poor old lady whom John Jr., Lena, and Anna had adroitly kept out of the way until her room was finished, actually burst into tears when first ushered into her light, airy apartment, in which everything looked so cheerful and pleasant. "Tilda has now and then a good streak," said she, while Aunt Milly, who had taken a great deal of interest in the repairing of the room, felt inclined to change her favorite theory with regard to her mistress' future condition. Chapter Roman 9. 5 years later, and in the fair city of Elms we again open the scene. It was commencement at Yale, and the crowd which filled the old Centre Church were listening breathlessly to the tide of eloquence poured forth by the young valedictorian. Durward Belmont, first in his studies, first in his class, and first in the esteem of his fellow students, had been unanimously chosen to that post of honor, and as the gathered multitude hung upon his words, and gazed upon his manly beauty, they felt that a better choice could not well have been made. At the right of the platform sat a group of ladies, friends, it would seem, of the speaker, for ever and anon his eyes turned in that direction, and, as if each glance incited him to fresh efforts, his eloquence increased, until at last no sound save that of his deep-toned voice was heard. So rapt was every one in the words of the young orator. But when his speech was ended, there arose deafening shouts of applause, while bouquets fell in perfect showers at his feet. Among them was one smaller and more elegant than the rest, and as if it were more precious, too. It was the first which Durward took from the floor. "See, Carrie, he gives you the preference," whispered one of the young ladies on the right, and Carrie Livingstone, for she it was, felt a thrill of gratified pride when she saw how carefully he guarded the bouquet, which during all the exercises she had made her especial care, calling attention to it in so many different ways that hardly any one who saw it in Durward's possession could fail of knowing from what source it came. But then everybody said they were engaged, so what did it matter? Everybody but John Jr., who was John Jr. still, and who, while openly denying the engagement, teasingly hinted that 'twas no fault of Cad's. For the last 3 years Carrie, Nellie, Mabel, and Anna had been inmates of the seminary in New Haven, and as they were now considered sufficiently accomplished to enter at once upon all the gaieties of fashionable life, John Jr. had come on to see the elephant, as he said, and to accompany them home. Carrie had fulfilled the promise of her girlhood, and even her brother acknowledged that she was handsome in spite of her nose, which, like everybody's else, still continued to be the most prominent feature of her face. She was proud, too, as well as beautiful, and throughout the city she was known as the haughty Southern belle, admired by some and disliked by many. Among the students she was not half so popular as her unpretending sister, whose laughing blue eyes and sunny brown hair were often toasted, together with the classical brow and dignified bearing of Nellie Douglas, who had lost some of the hoydenish propensities of her girlhood, and who was now a graceful, elegant creature just merging into 19, the pride of her widowed father, and the idol still of John Jr., whose boyish preference had ripened into a kind of love such as only he could feel. With poor Mabel Ross it had fared worse, her plain face and dumpy little figure never receiving the least attention except from Durward Belmont, who, pitying her lonely condition, frequently left more congenial society for the sake of entertaining her. Of any one else Carrie would have been jealous, but feeling sure that Mabel had no attraction save her wealth, and knowing that Durward did not care for that, she occasionally suffered him to leave her side, always feeling amply repaid by the evident reluctance with which he left her society for that of Mabel's. When ill-naturedly rallied by his companions upon his preference for Carrie, Durward would sometimes laughingly refer them to the old worn-out story of the fox and the grapes, for to scarcely anyone save himself did Carrie think it worth her while to be even gracious. This conduct was entirely at variance with her natural disposition, for she was fond of admiration, come from what source it might, and she would never have been so cold and distant to all save Durward, had she not once heard him say that he heartily despised a flirt, and that no young lady could at all interest him if he suspected her of being a coquette. This, then, was the secret of her reserve. She was resolved upon winning Durward Belmont, deeming no sacrifice too great if in the end it secured the prize. It is true there was one sophomore, a perfumed, brainless fop from Rockford, N. Y., who, next to Durward, was apparently most in favour, but the idea of her entertaining even a shadow of a liking for Tom Lakin was too ludicrous to be harboured for a moment, so his attentions went for naught, public opinion uniting in giving her to Mr. Belmont. With the lapse of years, Anna, too, had greatly improved. The extreme delicacy of her figure was gone, and though her complexion was as white and pure as marble, it denoted perfect health. With John Jr. she was still the favorite sister, the one whom he loved the best. Carrie was too stiff and proud, he said, and though when he met her in New Haven, after a year's absence, his greeting was kind and brotherly, he soon turned from her to Anna and Nellie, utterly neglecting Mabel, who turned away to her chamber to cry, because no one cared for her. Frequently had his mother reminded him of the importance of securing a wealthy bride, always finishing her discourse by speaking of Mr. Douglas' small income, and enlarging upon the immense wealth of Mabel Ross, whose very name had become disagreeable to John Jr. At one time his father had hoped he, too, would enter college, but the young man derided the idea of his ever making a scholar, saying, however, more in sport than in earnest, that he was willing to enter a store or learn a trade, so that in case he was ever obliged to earn his own living, he would have some means of doing it. But to this his mother would not listen. He was her darling boy, and his hands, soft and white as those of a girl, should never become hardened and embrowned by labor. So, while his sisters were away at school, he was at home, hunting, fishing, riding, teasing his grandmother, tormenting the servants, and shocking his mother by threatening to make love to his cousin Lena, to whom he was at once a pest and a comfort, and who now claims a share of our attention. It was decided to send Carrie and Anna to New Haven. Mr. Livingstone proposed that Lena should also accompany them, but this plan Mrs. Livingstone opposed with all her force, declaring that her money should never be spent in educating the beggarly relatives of her husband, who in this, as in numerous other matters, was forced to yield the point. As Mr. Everett's services were now no longer needed, he accepted the offer of a situation in the family of General Fontaine, a high-bred Southern gentleman, whose plantation was distant but half a mile from Maple Grove, as he there taught a regular school, having under his charge several of the daughters of the neighboring planters. It was decided that Lena also should continue under his instruction, Thus, while Carrie and Anna were going through the daily routine of a fashionable boarding school, Lena was storing her mind with useful knowledge. And though her accomplishments were not quite so showy as those of her cousins, they had in them the ring of the pure metal. Although her charms were as yet but partially developed, she was a creature of rare loveliness, and many who saw her for the first time marveled that aught so beautiful could be real. She had never seen Durward Belmont since that remarkable Christmas week. But many a time had her cheeks flushed with a feeling which she could not define, as she read Anna's accounts of the flattering attentions which he paid to Carrie, who, when at home, still treated her with haughty contempt or cool indifference. But for this she did not care. She knew she was loved by Anna and liked by John Jr. And she hoped, nay, half believed, that she was not wholly indifferent to her uncle, who, while he seldom made any show of his affection, still in his heart admired and felt proud of her. With his wife it was different. Lena hated her because she was beautiful and talented, and because in her presence Carrie and Anna were ever in the shade. Still, her niece was too general a favorite in the neighborhood to allow of open hostility at home, and so the proud woman ground together her glittering teeth and waited. Among the many who admired Lena, there was no one who gave her such full and unbounded homage as did her grandmother, whose life at Maple Grove had been one of shadow, seldom mingled with sunshine. Gradually had she learned the estimation in which she was held by her son's wife, and she felt how bitter it was to eat the bread of dependence. As far as she was able, Lena shielded her from the sneers of her aunt, who, thinking she had done all that was required of her when she fixed their room, would for days and even weeks appear utterly oblivious of their presence, or frown darkly whenever chance threw them in her way. She had raised no objection to Lena's continuing a pupil of Mr. Everett, who, she hoped, would not prove indifferent to her charms, fancying that in this way she would sooner be rid of one whom she feared as a rival of her daughters. But she was mistaken, for much as Malcolm Everett might admire Lena, another image than hers was enshrined in his heart, and most carefully guarded was the little golden curl, cut in seeming sport from the head it once adorned, and now treasured as a sacred memento of the past, believing that it would be so because she wished it to be so. Mrs. Livingstone had more than once whispered to her female friends her surmises that Malcolm Everett would marry Lena, and at the time of which we are speaking, it was pretty generally understood that a strong liking, at least, if not an engagement, existed between them. Old Captain Atherton, grown more smooth and portly, rubbed his fat hands complacently, and while applying Twig's preparation to his hair, congratulated himself that the only rival he had ever feared was now out of his way, thinking, too, that Lena had conferred a great favor upon himself by taking Mr. Everett from off his mind, became exceedingly polite to her, making her little presents and frequently asking her to ride. Whenever these invitations were accepted, they were sure to be followed by a ludicrous description to Anna, who laughed merrily over her cousin's letters, declaring herself half jealous of her gray-haired lover, as she termed the captain. All such communications were eagerly seized by Carrie, and fully discussed in the presence of Dorward, who gradually received the impression that Lena was a flirt, a species of womankind which he held in great abhorrence. Just before he left New Haven, he received a letter from his stepfather requesting him to stop for a day or two at Captain Atherton's, where he would join him, as he wished to look at a country seat near Mr. Livingstone's, which was now for sale. This plan gave immense satisfaction to Carrie, and when her brother proposed that Dorward should stop at their father's instead of the captain's, she seconded the invitation so warmly that Dorward finally consented, and word was immediately sent to Mrs. Livingstone to hold herself in readiness to receive Mr. Belmont. "Oh, I do hope your father will secure Woodlawn," said Carrie, as in the parlor of the Burnett House, Cincinnati. They were discussing the projected purchase. The other young ladies had gone out shopping, and John Jr., who was present, and who felt just like teasing his sister, replied, "What do you care? Mrs. Graham has no daughters, and she won't fancy such a chit as you, so it must be Dorward's society that you so much desire, but I can assure you that your nose will be broken when once he sees our Lena." Carrie turned toward the window to hide her wrath at this speech, while Dorward asked if Miss Rivers were so very handsome. "Handsome," repeated John. "That don't begin to express it. Cat is what I call handsome, but Lena is beautiful, more beautiful, most beautiful now you have it superlatively. Such complexion, such eyes, such hair, I will be hanged if I haven't been more than half in love with her myself." "I really begin to tremble," said Dorward laughingly, while Carrie rejoined, "You've only to make the slightest advance, and your love will be returned tenfold, for Lena is very susceptible, and already encourages several admirers." "There, my fair sister, you are slightly mistaken," interrupted John Jr., who was going on farther in his remarks, when Dorward asked if she ever left any marks of her affection, referring to the scratch she had given Carrie, who, before her brother had time to speak, replied that the will and the clause remained the same, though common decency kept them hidden when it was necessary. "That's downright slander," said John Jr., determined now upon defending his cousin. "Lena has a high temper, I acknowledge, but she tries hard to govern it, and for nearly 2 years I've not seen her angry once, though she's had every provocation under heaven." "She knows when and where to be amiable," retorted Carrie. "Any one of her admirers would tell the same story with yourself." At this juncture John Jr. was called for a moment from the room, and Carrie, fearing she had said too much, immediately apologized to Dorward, saying it was not often that she allowed herself to speak against her cousin, and that she should not have done so now, or not John so much blinded, that her mother, knowing Lena's ambitious nature, sometimes seriously feared the consequence. "I know," said she, "that John fancies Nellie, but Lena's influence over him is very great." Dorward made no reply, and Carrie continued, "I am always sorry when I speak against Lena. She is my cousin, and I wouldn't prejudice any one against her, so you must forget my unkind remarks, which would never have been uttered in the presence of a stranger." She is handsome and agreeable, and you must like her in spite of what I said. I cannot refuse when so fair a lady pleads her cause, was Durward's gallant answer, and as the other young ladies then entered the room, the conversation ceased. Meanwhile Lena was very differently employed. Nearly a year had elapsed since she had seen her cousins, and her heart bounded with joy at the thought of meeting Anna, whom she dearly loved. Carrie was to her an object of indifference, rather than dislike, and ofttimes had she thought, if she would only let me love her, but it could not be, for there was no affinity between them. Carrie was proud and overbearing, jealous of her high-spirited cousin, who, as John Jr. had said, strove hard to subdue her temper, and who now seldom resented Carrie's insults, except when they were leveled at her aged grandmother. As we have before stated, news had been received at Maple Grove that Durward would accompany her cousins home. Mr. Graham would, of course, join him there, and accordingly extensive preparations were immediately commenced. An unusual degree of sickness was prevailing among the female portion of Mrs. Livingstone's servants, and the very day before the company was expected, Aunt Milly, the head cook, was taken suddenly ill. Coaxing, scolding, and threatening were alike ineffectual. The old negress would not say she was well when she wasn't, and as Hagar, the next in command, was also sick lazy, as her mistress called it, Mrs. Livingstone was herself obliged to superintend the cookery. Crosser than a bar, as the little darkies said, she flew back and forth, from kitchen to pantry, her bunch of keys rattling, the corners of her mouth drawn back, and her hands raised ready to strike at anything that came in her way, as if there were a fatality attending her movements. She was unfortunate in whatever she undertook. The cake was burned black, the custard curdled, the preserves were found to be working, the big preserve dish got broken, a thunder shower soured the cream, and taking it all in all, she really had trouble enough to disconcert the most experienced housekeeper. Still, the few negroes able to assist thought she needn't be so fetched and cross. But cross she was, feeling more than once inclined to lay witchcraft to the charge of old Milly, who, comfortably ensconced in bed, listened in dismay to the disastrous accounts brought her from time to time from the kitchen, mentally congratulating herself the while upon not being within hearing of her mistress' tongue. Once Mrs. Nichols attempted to help, but she was repulsed so angrily that Lena did not presume to offer her services until the day of their arrival, when, without a word, she repaired to the chambers, which she swept and dusted, arranging the furniture, and making everything ready for the comfort of the travellers. Then, descending to the parlours, she went through the same process there, filled the vases with fresh flowers, looped back the curtains, opened the piano, wheeled the sofa a little to the right, the large chair a little to the left, and then going to the dining-room, she set the table in the most perfect order, doing all so quietly that her aunt knew nothing of it until it was done. Jake, the coachman, had gone down to Frankfort after them, and as he was not expected to return until between 3 and 4, dinner was deferred until that hour. From sunrise Mrs. Livingstone had worked industriously, until her face and temper were at a boiling heat. The clock was on the point of striking 3, and she was bending over a roasting turkey, when Lena ventured to approach her, saying, "I have seen Aunt Millie baste a turkey many a time, and I am sure I can do it as well as she." "Well, what of it?" was the uncivil answer. Lena's temper choked her, but forcing it down, she replied, "Why, it is almost 3, and I thought perhaps you would want to cool and dress yourself before they came." "I can see to the dinner, I know I can. Please let me try." Somewhat mollified by her niece's kind manner, Mrs. Livingstone resigned her post and repaired to her own room, while Lena, confining her long curls to the top of her head, and donning the wide check apron which her aunt had thrown aside, set herself at work with a right good will. "What dat are you say?" exclaimed Aunt Millie, lifting her woolly head from her pillow, and looking at the little colored girl, who had brought to her the news that young Miss was in de kitchen. "What dat are you tellin'? Miss Lenny pockin' 'mong de pots and kittles, and dis ole nigger lazin' in bed jes like white folks. Long as 'twas ole Miss, I didn't see her. Good 'nough for her to roast, blister, and bile. Done get used to it, case she's got to in kingdom come. No mistake he, but little Miss Lenny, it's too bad to bake her lamb's wool hands and face. And all de quality common. I will hobble up thar if I can stand." Suiting the action to the word, she got out of bed, and crawling up to the kitchen, insisted upon taking Lena's place, saying she could sit in her chair and tell the rest what to do. For a time Lena hesitated. The old woman seemed so faint and weak, but the sound of wheels decided her. Springing to the sideboard in the dining room, she brought Aunt Millie a glass of wine, which revived her so much that she now felt willing to leave her. By this time the carriage was at the door, and to escape unobserved was now her great object. But this she could not do, for as she was crossing the hall Anna espied her, and darting forward, seized her around the neck, at the same time dragging her toward Carrie, who, with Durward's eye upon her, kissed her twice. Then turning to him, she said, "I suppose you do not need an introduction to Miss Rivers." Durward was almost guilty of the rudeness of staring at the strangeness of Lena's appearance, for as nearly as she could, she looked like a fright. Bending over hot stoves and boiling gravies is not very beneficial to one's complexion, and Lena's cheeks, neck, forehead, and nose were of a purplish red. Her hair was tucked back in a manner exceedingly unbecoming, while the broad check apron, which came nearly to her feet, tended in nowise to improve her appearance. She felt it keenly, and after returning Durward's salutation, she broke away before Anna or John Jr., who were both surprised at her looks, had time to ask a question. Running up to her room, her first impulse was to cry, but knowing that would disfigure her still more, she bathed her burning face and neck, brushed out her curls, threw on a simple muslin dress, and started for the parlor, of which Durward and Carrie were at that moment the only occupants. As she was passing the outer door, she observed upon one of the piazza pillars a half-blown rose, and for a moment stopped to admire it. Doward, who sat in a corner, did not see her, but Carrie did, and a malicious feeling prompted her to draw out her companion, who she felt sure was disappointed in Lena's face. They were speaking of a lady whom they saw at Frankfort, and whom Carrie pronounced perfectly beautiful, while Doward would hardly admit that she was even good-looking. "I am surprised at your taste," said Carrie, adding, as she noticed the proximity of her cousin, "I think she resembles Lena. And of course you will acknowledge she is beautiful." "She was beautiful 5 years ago, but she's greatly changed since then," answered Doward, never suspecting the exquisite satisfaction his words afforded Carrie, who replied, "You had better keep that opinion to yourself, and not express it before Captain Atherton or Brother John." "Who takes my name in vain?" asked John Jr., himself appearing at a side door. "Oh, John," said Carrie, "we were just disputing about Lena. Doward does not think her handsome." "Doward be hanged," answered John, making a feint of drawing from his pocket a pistol which was not there. "What fault has he to find with Lena? A little too rosy, that's all," said Doward, laughingly, while John continued, "She did look confounded red and dowdyish for her. I don't understand it myself." Here the hem of the muslin dress on which Carrie's eye had all the while been resting disappeared, and as there was no longer an incentive for ill-natured remarks, the amiable young lady adroitly changed the conversation. John Jr. also caught a glimpse of the retreating figure, and started in pursuit, in the course of his search passing the kitchen, where he was instantly hailed by Aunt Milly, who, while bemoaning her own aches and pains, did not fail to tell him how Miss Lena, like a born angel dropped right out of eternity, had been in Thar, burning her skin to a fiery red, a-trying to get up a tip-top dinner. "So-ho," thought the young man, "that explains it," and turning on his heel, he walked back to the house just as the last bell was ringing for dinner. On entering the dining-room, he found all the family assembled, except Lena. She had excused herself on the plea of a severe headache, and now in her own room was chiding herself for being so much affected by a remark accidentally overheard. What did she care if Doward did think her plain? He was nothing to her, and never would be, and again she bathed her head, which really was aching sadly. "And so Lena's got the headache," said John Jr. "Well, I don't wonder, cooking all the dinner as she did." "What do you mean?" asked Anna, while Mrs. Livingstone's angry frown bade her son keep silence. Filial obedience, however, was not one of John Jr.'s cardinal virtues, and in a few words he repeated what Aunt Milly had told him, adding aside to Doward, "This explains the extreme rosiness which so much offended your lordship. And next you see her, you will change your mind," suddenly remembering that his grandmother had not been introduced. He now presented her to Doward. The noble's blood had long been forgotten, but Grandma was never at a loss for a subject, and she commenced talking notwithstanding Carrie's efforts to keep her still. "Now, I think, Aunt Caroline," said she at last, turning to her granddaughter, "now I think, Aunt, What made you propose to have my dinner sent up to my room? I hain't it there but once this great while, and that was the day General Fontaine's folks were here, and Matilda thought I warn't able to come down." Durward's half-concealed smile showed that he understood it all, while John Jr., in his element when his grandmother was talking, managed to lead her on, until she reached her favorite theme, Nancy Scavendike. Here a look from her son silenced her, and as dinner was just then over, Durward missed of hearing that remarkable lady's history. Late in the afternoon, as the family were sitting upon the piazza, Lena joined them. Her headache had passed away, leaving her face a shade whiter than usual. The flush was gone from her forehead and nose, but mindful of Durward's remark, the roses deepened on her cheek, which only increased her loveliness. "I acknowledge that I was wrong. Your cousin is beautiful," whispered Durward to Carrie, who, mentally hating the beauty which had never before struck her so forcibly, replied in her softest tones, "I knew you would, and I hope you will be equally ready to forgive her for winning hearts only to break them. For with that face how can she help it? A handsome face is no excuse for coquetry," answered Durward. "Neither can I think Miss Rivers guilty of it. At all events, I mean to venture a little nearer," and before Carrie could frame a reasonable excuse for keeping him at her side, he had crossed ever and taken a seat by Lena, with whom he was soon in the midst of an animated conversation, his surprise each moment increasing at the depth of intellect she displayed, for the beauty of her mind was equal to that of her person. Had it not been for the remembrance of Carrie's insinuations, his admiration would have been complete. But anything like coquetry he heartily despised, and one great secret of his liking for Carrie was her evident freedom from that fault. As yet he had seen nothing to condemn in Lena's conduct. Wholly unaffected, she talked with him as she would have talked with any stranger, and still there was in her manner a certain coldness for which he could not account. "Perhaps she thinks me not worth the winning," thought he, and in spite of his principles, he ere long found himself exerting all his powers to please and interest her. About tea-time, Captain Atherton rode into the yard, and simultaneously with his arrival, Mr. Everett came also. Immediately remembering what he had heard, Durward, in his eagerness to watch Lena, failed to note the crimson flush on Anna's usually pale cheek. As Malcolm bent over her with his low-spoken, tender words of welcome, and when the physicky captain, claiming the privilege of an old friend, kissed the blushing Anna, Durward in his blindness attributed the scornful expression of Lena's face to a feeling of unwillingness that any save herself should share the attentions even of the captain, and in this impression he was ere long confirmed. Drawing his chair up to Anna, Captain Atherton managed to keep Malcolm at a distance, while he himself wholly monopolized the young girl, who cast imploring glances toward her cousin, as if asking for relief. Many a time, on similar occasions, had Lena claimed the attention of the captain, for the sake of leaving Anna free to converse with Malcolm. And now, understanding what was wanted of her, she nodded in token that she would come to the rescue. Just then Mrs. Livingstone, who had kept an eye upon her niece, drew near, and as she seemed to want a seat, Lena instantly arose and offered hers, going herself to the place where the captain was sitting. Ere long, her lively sallies and the captain's loud laugh began to attract Mrs. Livingstone's attention, and observing that Durward's eyes were frequently drawn that way, she thought proper to make some remarks concerning the impropriety of her niece's conduct. "I do wish," said she, apparently speaking more to herself than to Durward, "I do wish Lena would learn discretion, and let Captain Atherton alone, when she knows how much her behaviour annoys Mr. Everett." "Is Mr. Everett anything to her?" asked Durward, half hoping that she would not confirm what Carrie had before hinted. "If he isn't, he ought to be," answered Mrs. Livingstone, with an ominous shake of the head. "Rumor says they are engaged, and though when questioned she denies it, she gives people abundant reason to think so. And yet every chance she gets, she flirts with Captain Atherton, as you see her doing now." "What can she or any other young girl possibly want of that old man?" asked Durward, laughing at the very idea. "He is rich, Lena is poor, proud, and ambitious. There lies the secret," was Mrs. Livingstone's reply, and thinking she had said enough for the present, she excused herself, while she went to give orders concerning supper. John Jr. and Carrie, too, had disappeared, and thus left to himself, Durward had nothing to do but to watch Lena, who, as she saw symptoms of desertion in the anxious glances which the captain cast toward Anna, redoubled her exertions to keep him at her side, thus confirming Durward in the belief that she really was what her aunt and Carrie had represented her to be. "Poor, proud, and ambitious" rang in his ears, and as he mistook the mischievous look which Lena frequently sent toward Anna and Malcolm for a desire to see how the latter was affected by her conduct, he thought fickle as fair, at the same time congratulating himself that he had obtained an insight into her real character. Ere her exceeding beauty and agreeable manners had made any particular impression upon him. Knowing she had done nothing to offend him, and feeling piqued at his indifference, Lena in turn treated him so coldly that even Carrie was satisfied with the phase which affairs had assumed, and that night expressed her pleasure that matters were progressing so finely. "You've no idea, mother," said she, "how much he detests anything like coquetry. Nellie Douglas thinks it's a kind of monomania with him, and I am inclined to believe it is so." "In that case," answered Mrs. Livingstone, "it behooves you, in his presence, to be very careful how you demean yourself toward other gentlemen. I haven't lived 19 years for nothing," said Carrie, folding her soft white hands complacently one over the other. "Speaking of Nellie Douglas," continued Mrs. Livingstone, who had long desired this interview with her daughter, "speaking of Nellie reminds me of your brother, who seems perfectly crazy about her." "And what if he does?" asked Carrie, her thoughts far more intent upon Durward Belmont than her brother. "Isn't Nellie good enough for him?" "Yes, good enough, I admit," returned her mother, "but I think I can find a far more suitable match. Mabel Ross, for instance. Her fortune is said to be immense, while Mr. Douglas is worth little or nothing." when you bring about a union between John Livingstone, Jr. and Mabel Ross, I shall have full confidence in your powers to do anything, even to the marrying of Anna and Grandfather Atherton," answered Carrie, to whom her mother's schemes were no secret. "And that, too, I will effect, rather than see her thrown away upon a low-bred northerner, who shall never wed her, never." And the haughty woman paced up and down her room, devising numerous ways by which her long-cherished threefold plan should be effected. The next morning Durward arose much earlier than was his usual custom, and going out into the garden, he came suddenly upon Lena. "This," said he, "is a pleasure which I did not expect when I rather unwillingly tore myself from my pillow." All the coldness of the night before was gone, but Lena could not so soon forget, and quite indifferently she answered that she learned to rise early among the New England hills. "An excellent practice, and one which more of our young ladies would do well to imitate," returned Durward, at the same time speaking of the beautifying effect which the morning air had upon her complexion. Lena reddened, for she recalled his words of yesterday concerning her plainness, and somewhat sharply she replied that any information regarding her personal appearance was wholly unnecessary, as she knew very well how she looked. Durward bit his lip, and resolving never to compliment her again, walked on in silence at her side, while Lena, repenting of her hasty words, and desirous of making amends, exerted herself to be agreeable, and by the time the breakfast bell rang, Durward mentally pronounced her a perfect mystery, which he would take delight in unraveling. Chapter X. Mr. and Mrs. Graham. Breakfast had been some time over, when the roll of carriage wheels and a loud ring at the door announced the arrival of Mr. Graham, who, true to his appointment with Durward, had come up to meet him. Accompanied by Mrs. Graham, this lady, who could boast of having once been the bride of an English lord, to say nothing of belonging to the very first family of Virginia, was a sort of bugbear to Mrs. Livingstone, who, haughty and overbearing to her equals, was nevertheless cringing and cowardly in the presence of those whom she considered her superiors. Never having seen Mrs. Graham, her ideas concerning her were quite elevated, and now when she came unexpectedly, it quite overcame her. Unfortunately, too, she was this morning suffering from a nervous headache, the result of the excitement and late hours of the night before, and on learning that Mrs. Graham was in the parlor, she fell back in her rocking-chair, and between a groan and a sigh, declared her utter inability to see her at present, saying that Carrie must play the part of hostess until such time as she felt composed enough to undertake it. "Oh, I can't, I shan't, that ends it," said Carrie, who, though a good deal dressed on Durward's account, still felt anxious to give a few more finishing touches to her toilet, and to see if her hair and complexion were all right, ere she ventured into the august presence of her mother-in-law-elect. As she confidently considered Mrs. Graham, "Anna must go, then," persisted Mrs. Livingstone, who knew full well how useless it would be to press Carrie farther. "Anna must go. Where is she? Call her, Lena." But Anna was away over the fields, enjoying with Mr. Everett a walk which had been planned the night previous. And when Lena returned with the intelligence that she was nowhere to be found, her aunt in great distress exclaimed, "Mercy me, what will Mrs. Graham think? And Mr. Livingstone, too, keeps running back and forth for somebody to entertain her. What shall I do? I can't go in looking so yellow and jaded as I now do." Lena's first thought was to bring her aunt's powder ball as the surest way of remedying the yellow skin. But knowing that such an act would be deeply resented, she quickly repressed the idea, offering instead to go herself to the parlor. What could you say to her?" returned Mrs. Livingstone, to whom the proposition was not altogether displeasing. "I can at least answer her questions," returned Lena, and after a moment her aunt consented, wondering the while how Lena, in her plain gingham wrapper and linen collar, could be willing to meet the fashionable Mrs. Graham. But then, thought she has so little sensibility, I don't suppose she cares. And why should she? Mrs. Graham will of course look upon her as only a little above a servant, and with this complimentary reflection upon her niece. Mrs. Livingstone retired to her dressing-room, while Lena, with a beating heart and slightly heightened color, repaired to the parlor. On a sofa by the window sat Mrs. Graham, and the moment Lena's eye fell upon her, her fears vanished, while she could hardly repress a smile at the idea of being afraid of her. She was a short, dumpy, florid-looking woman, showily, and, as Lena thought, overdressed for mourning, as her person was covered with jewelry, which flashed and sparkled with every movement. Her forehead was very low, and marked by a scowl of discontent which was habitual. For, with everything to make her happy, Mrs. Graham was far from being so. Exceedingly nervous and fidgety, she was apt to see only the darker side, and when her husband and son, who were of exactly opposite temperaments, strove to laugh her into good spirits, they generally made the matter worse, as she usually reproached them with having no feeling or sympathy for her. Accustomed to a great deal of attention, she had fretted herself into quite a fever at Mrs. Livingstone's apparent lack of courtesy in not hastening to receive her. And when Lena's light step was heard in the hall, she turned toward the door with a frown which seemed to ask why she had not come sooner. Howard, who was present, immediately introduced his mother, at the same time admiring the extreme dignity of Lena's manner as she received the lady's greeting. Apologizing for her aunt's non-appearance, saying she was suffering from a severe headache, and begged to be excused for an hour or so. "Quite excusable," returned Mrs. Graham, at the same time saying something in a low tone about its not being her wish to stop there so early, as she knew she was not expected, but perfectly welcome, nevertheless, Lena hastened to say, thinking that for the time being the reputation of her uncle's house was resting upon her shoulders. "I dare say," was Mrs. Graham's ungracious answer, and then her little gray, deep-set eyes rested upon Lena, wondering if she were a governess or what, and thinking it strange that she should seem so perfectly self-possessed. Insensibly, too, Lena's manner won upon her, for, spite of her fretfulness, Mrs. Graham at heart was a kindly disposed woman. Ill health and long years of dissipation had helped to make her what she was. Besides this, she was not quite happy in her domestic relations, for though Mr. Graham possessed all the requisites of a kind and affectionate husband, he could not remove from her mind the belief that he liked others better than he did herself. 'Twas in vain that he alternately laughed at and reasoned with her on the subject. She was not to be convinced, and so poor Mr. Graham, who was really exceedingly polite and affable to the ladies, was almost constantly provoking the green-eyed monster by his attentions to some one of the fair sex. In spite of his nightly caudal lectures, he would transgress again and again, until his wife's patience was exhausted. And now she affected to have given him up, turning for comfort and affection toward Durward, who was her special delight. The very apple of her eye, he was so much like his father, Sir Arthur, who during the whole year that she lived with him had never once given her cause for jealousy. Just before Lena entered the parlor, Mr. Graham had for a moment stepped out with Mr. Livingstone, but soon returning, he, too, was introduced to the young lady. It was strange, considering Lena's uncommon beauty, that Mrs. Graham did not watch her husband's manner. But for once in her life she felt no fears, and looking from the window, she failed to note the sudden pallor which overspread his face when Mr. Livingstone presented to him Miss Rivers, my niece. Mr. Graham was a tall, finely formed man with a broad, good-humored face, whose expression instantly demanded respect from strangers, while his pleasant, affable deportment universally won the friendship of all who knew him. And Lena was not an exception to the general rule, for the moment his warm hand grasped hers and his kindly beaming eye rested upon her, her heart went toward him as a friend, while she wondered why he looked at her so long and earnestly, twice repeating her name, Miss Rivers. From the first, Lena had recognized him as the same gentleman whom Durward had called father in the cars years ago. And when, as if to apologize for his singular conduct, he asked if they had never met before, she referred him to that time, saying she thought it strange that he should remember her. Old acquaintances are indeed, and little Mrs. Graham nodded and fanned, while her round, florid face grew more florid, and her linen cambric went up to her forehead as if trying to smooth out the scowl which was of too long standing to be smoothed. "Yes, my dear," said Mr. Graham, turning toward his wife, "I had entirely forgotten the circumstance, but it seems I saw her in the cars when we took our Eastern tour 6 or 7 years ago." "You were quite a little girl then," turning to Lena, "only 10, was the reply, and Mrs. Graham, ashamed of herself and anxious to make amends, softened considerable toward Lena, asking how long she had lived in Kentucky, where she used to live, and where her mother was. At this question, Mr. Graham, who was talking with Mr. Livingstone, suddenly stopped. "My mother is dead," answered Lena. "And your father?" "Gone to Canada," interrupted Durward, who had heard vague rumors of Lena's parentage, and who did not quite like his mother's being so inquisitive. Mrs. Graham laughed. She always did at whatever Durward said, while Mr. Graham replied to a remark made by Mr. Livingstone some time before. Here John Jr. appeared, and after being formally introduced, he seated himself by his cousin, addressing to her some trivial remark. and calling her Lena. It was well for Mr. Graham's after-peace that his wife was just then too much engrossed with Durward to observe the effect which that name produced upon him. Abruptly rising, he turned toward Mr. Livingstone, saying, "You were telling me about a fine species of cactus which you have in your yard. Suppose we go and see it?" The cactus having been duly examined, praised, and commented upon, Mr. Graham casually remarked, "Your niece is a fine-looking girl, Lena." "I think your son called her." "Yes, or Helena. Which was her mother's name?" "And her mother was your sister, Helena Livingstone?" "No, Sir Nicholas. I changed my name to gratify a fancy of my wife," returned Mr. Livingstone, thinking it better to tell the truth at once. Again Mr. Graham bent over the cactus, inspecting it minutely, and keeping his face for a long time concealed from his friend, whose thoughts, as was usually the case when his sister was mentioned, were far back in the past. When at last Mr. Graham lifted his head, there were no traces of the stormy emotions which had shaken his very heartstrings, and with a firm, composed step he walked back to the parlor, where he found both Mrs. Livingstone and Carrie just paying their respects to his lady. Nothing could be more marked than the difference between Carrie's and Lena's manner toward Mrs. Graham. Even Durward noticed it, and while he could not sufficiently admire the quiet self-possession of the latter, who in her simple morning wrapper and linen collar had met his mother on perfectly equal terms, he for the first time in his life felt a kind of contempt-pity, he called it, for Carrie, who, in an elegantly embroidered double gown confined by a rich cord and tassels, which almost swept the floor, treated his mother with a fawning servility as disgusting to him as it was pleasing to the lady in question. Accustomed to the utmost deference on account of her wealth and her husband's station, Mrs. Graham had felt as if something were withheld from her. When neither Mrs. Livingstone nor her daughters rushed to receive and welcome her, but now all was forgotten. For nothing could be more flattering than their attentions. Both mother and daughter, having the son in view, did their best, and when at last Mrs. Graham asked to be shown to her room, Carrie, instead of ringing for a servant, offered to conduct her thither herself, whereupon Mrs. Graham laid her hand caressingly upon her shoulders, calling her a dear little pet, and asking where she stole those bright, naughty eyes. A smothered laugh from John Jr., and a certain low soft sound which he was in the habit of producing when desirous of reminding his sister of her nose, made the bright, naughty eyes flash so angrily that even Durward noticed it, and wondered if Lena's temper had not been transferred to her cousin. "That young girl Lena, I think you call her, is a relative of yours," said Mrs. Graham to Carrie, as they were ascending the stairs. "Is our cousin, I suppose," answered Carrie. "She bears a very aristocratic name, that of Rivers. Does she belong to a Virginia family?" Carrie looked mysterious and answered, "I never knew anything of her father, and indeed, I reckon no one does." Then, after a moment, she added, "Almost every family has some objectionable relative with which they could willingly dispense." "Very true," returned Mrs. Graham. "What a pity we couldn't all have been born in England." "There, dear, you can leave me now. Accordingly, Carrie started for the parlor meeting in the hall. Thanks for watching this video. Book is provided by StreamBooks.